I learned early that in my family there was only one son, and it wasn't me. My name is Mira Dalton, and I was just the shadow he cast. I spent my entire life working to be seen, grinding my way through architecture school, convinced that my success would finally make them proud. This graduation was supposed to be the proof. But as I walked across that stage to get my master's degree, my eyes found them 3 empty seats in the front row, each one with my family's name on it. They chose my brother's bad day over my life's biggest moment. That was the day I stopped waiting for their applause and started planning my own. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeaker, mangling the name of the graduate before me. I didn't hear it. I was too busy scanning the front row, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with pride, but with a frantic, familiar anxiety. The fabric of my gown felt heavy, the mortarboard tight on my head. This was it. The culmination of 6 years of sleepless nights, caffeine-fueled study sessions, and a debt load that felt like its own physical weight. This was the moment I had been working toward, the one I had told them about, circled on their calendar, and confirmed 3 separate times. Mira Dalton. My name, clear and sudden, pulled me from my search. I forced my feet to move, walking across the stage toward the dean. The applause was a dull roar, like static, completely hollow. As I reached for my diploma, my eyes locked on the seats. Section A, Row 1, seats 4, 5, and 6. 3 white folding chairs, each with a small printed sign taped to the back, Dalton. All 3 were empty. I smiled for the camera, the paper in my hand suddenly feeling like nothing at all. This wasn't new. It was just the loudest silence they had ever left me in. My childhood in our modest Minnesota town was a masterclass in this kind of quiet. We looked the part, Carl and Donna Dalton, hardworking parents, and their 2 children, Evan and Mira. We were the family that brought hottish to church potlucks and waved to neighbors. But behind the vinyl siding of our split-level home, the hierarchy was absolute. My older brother Evan was the son. We all just orbited his needs. He was the golden boy, all charisma and reckless charm, adored by everyone, especially our parents. I was the other one, the responsible one. The one taught to keep quiet, to fix the problems Evan caused, and to stay firmly out of the spotlight he so desperately craved. I learned early that my purpose was to be the ballast that kept the family ship steady, to be the invisible scaffolding that held Evan up. I remember the smell of vinegar and blue food coloring from my 5th-grade science project. It was a volcano cliché, but meticulously crafted. I had spent weeks on the papier-mâché, getting the slope just right, testing the baking soda to vinegar ratio until the eruption was perfect. The night before it was due, Evan came into my room, his face pale with the kind of panic I knew well. He'd forgotten. He'd spent his weekend at a friend's house and had nothing. I saw the look in his eyes, and then the look my mother gave me from the hallway. "Just let him have it, Mira. It's not a big deal. You can make another one." But there wasn't time to make another one, so I gave him mine. I watched him walk onto the stage at the science fair, grinning as he accepted the first-place ribbon. That night, my father Carl carefully mounted the blue ribbon in a shadow box and hung it in the living room. "That's my boy," he'd said, ruffling Evan's hair. My name was never mentioned. That framed ribbon became a monument to my role. I wasn't meant to be celebrated. I was meant to facilitate his celebration. This lesson was hammered home again and again. The money I'd saved from waitressing the nest egg I had guarded fiercely for my college applications vanished overnight. I found out from a stray piece of mail on the kitchen counter, a receipt from a law firm. Evan, driving home from a party, had gotten a DUI. My entire college savings had been reallocated to his attorney. When I confronted my mother, her hands deep in dishwater, she wouldn't even look at me. "Mira, honey, your brother needs direction," she'd said. Her voice soft and full of that familiar, weary apology. "He gets so turned around. You can take care of yourself. You always have." It wasn't a compliment. It was a condemnation. It meant I was on my own. It meant my dreams were expendable and his mistakes were investments. so I learned. I learned to stop seeking validation through affection, because affection was a resource reserved for Evan. Instead, I sought it through achievement. I poured every ounce of myself into my grades, my portfolio, my applications. I got scholarships. I took out loans. I worked 3 jobs while carrying a full course load in architecture school. I built a life for myself, brick by painful brick, fueled by the quiet rage of being unseen. I convinced myself that if I just achieved enough, if I became so successful that they couldn't ignore me, then they would finally see me. This graduation wasn't just a ceremony. It was meant to be the proof. The proof that I had, in fact, taken care of myself. After the ceremony, I sat alone in my decade-old sedan, the diploma lying on the passenger seat. The parking lot was emptying out, filled with the sounds of happy families laughing and taking pictures. I just stared at the steering wheel, the silence in the car ringing in my ears. My phone buzzed on the console, a text from my mom. My fingers felt numb as I picked it up. "Sorry, sweetie. Something came up with Evan. He had a really bad day. We just couldn't leave him. We'll celebrate another time, I promise." A hollow laugh escaped my throat. Something always came up with Evan. I had just walked across a stage, the first person in our family to earn a master's degree, and my brother having a bad day was more important. They had left 3 seats empty because the sun had demanded their orbit. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone, at the cap still sitting crooked on my head. I finally whispered the words that had been building inside me for 20 years. There won't be another time. That promise to myself was sealed with the click of the U-Haul latch. I didn't go back home. I drove straight to Minneapolis and moved into a tiny studio apartment in a building that smelled like boiled cabbage and dust. The ad had called it vintage. That meant the air conditioner was a rattling window unit that only blew lukewarm air, and the radiator in winter clanged like a hammer on an anvil, offering barely enough heat to keep the pipes from freezing. It was all I could afford. Those first few months were a blur of sheer survival. I was building a life from the ground up with no safety net and no cosigner. I worked obsessively because working was the only thing that kept the silence at bay. When I wasn't drafting floor plans for a small architectural firm that paid me peanuts, I was taking on freelance design gigs, from Craigslist, sketching logos for coffee shops and layouts for kitchen remodels. And 3 nights a week, I worked the late shift at a hardware store, stocking shelves and mixing paint. The fluorescent lights humming over my head until 2 in the morning. This was the American dream. They never show you building your future, not just with bare hands, but with hands raw from drywall dust and aching from carpal tunnel. I was fueled by grit, perseverance, and the bone-deep terror of failure. I poured my exhaustion into my work. In the slivers of time between jobs, I started a personal project redesigning forgotten spaces. I'd find photos of rundown buildings and draw by hand what they could be. I sketched detailed renovations, my pencils flying across the vellum, imagining new life in the urban decay. One night, fueled by cheap coffee and frustration, I posted a few of them on a local Minneapolis subreddit. I just put them out there expecting nothing. I woke up to my phone buzzing so hard it nearly fell off the nightstand. The post had gone viral. People were commenting, sharing, praising the vision. A local blog picked it up. And then a small construction firm, a real one, not just a guy with a truck, called me. They had a client who wanted a gut renovation and had seen my sketches. They wanted to hire me for the redesign. It was my first real contract. The paycheck wasn't huge, but when I held it, it felt heavier than my diploma. 2 years passed like that. 2 years of grinding, of building a reputation, one small project at a time. The work got better. The clients got bigger. I finally moved out of the cabbage-scented studio and into a 1-bedroom with working heat. My first major self-reward wasn't a vacation or a designer bag. It was a 2012 Jeep Wrangler, used but solid, and a professional-grade drafting table. The day they were delivered, I just stood in my living room and ran my hand over the smooth wood of the table. I had bought this. Not my parents, not Evan. Me. My work. My success. It was the first time I felt truly stable, truly independent. In those 2 years, my family only checked in when Evan needed something. There were no, "How are you" calls, no "We're proud of you" texts. Just, "Mira, Evan needs help with his resume, can you fix it?" Or, "Honey, Evan's a little short on gas money. Could you send him a few dollars?" And the big one, "Your brother found a great new apartment, but his credit isn't great. He just needs you to co-sign the lease. It's just a formality." I stared at that text message for a long time. I thought about my own credit score built with meticulous, painful precision. I thought about my savings, the ones that had been reallocated. I typed back one word: no. My thumb hovered over the send button. The familiar, sickening wave of guilt washed over me. I was the responsible one. I was supposed to fix this. "You can take care of yourself." My mother's voice. But this time it sounded different. Yes, I could. And I did. And he would have to as well. I pressed send. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a sharp, cold jolt of relief. It was terrifying. It was freeing. My no must have sent a shockwave I didn't feel, because the silence from them became absolute. 18 months passed without a single word. In that time, my world changed. My small firm landed a major contract, the abandoned North Loop factory. It was a massive, crumbling brick behemoth that had been empty for decades, and we won the bid to transform it into a mixed-use space with loft shops and a public greenway. It was the project of a lifetime. My name was on the proposal, my designs were the centerpiece. It became a regional headline. Local architect Mira Dalton to revitalize historic landmark. I saw my face in the Minneapolis Business Journal. I was giving interviews. I was seen. Then one Tuesday evening my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "Hello." There was a pause, a sound of someone clearing their throat. "Mira." My blood went cold. It was my father. After 18 months of total silence, his voice was stiff, unfamiliar, and laced with an authority I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Mira, we need to talk. Tonight." The drive home was a surreal trip through a life I had already shed. Every mile closer to my childhood house, my shoulders tensed, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. I passed the same landmarks I had once dreamed of, escaping the town sign, the high school football field, the sleepy main street. It all felt smaller, frozen in time while I had been forced to grow. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, my headlights illuminated the first change. A brand new metallic red Ford F-150 was parked where my father's old sedan used to be. The landscaping along the walkway was new too, professionally done with tasteful uplighting on the birch trees. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. This was the fruit of Evan's newest business venture, no doubt the one my mother had vaguely mentioned in a text. It was all flash, no substance. I parked my reliable, hard-earned Jeep behind it and took a deep breath before walking inside. The dinner was a performance of strained normalcy. My mother Donna fluttered around the kitchen, her face tight with a forced smile, serving a roast beef that was slightly overcooked. Evan sat at the table, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that was half admiration, half resentment. "Well, well," he said as I sat down. "The big-shot architect. Finally found time to visit the little people." I ignored him, my eyes on my father. Carl was quiet, assessing me, his expression unreadable. My mother tried to fill the silence, launching into a long, rambling monologue about Evan's recent triumphs. He had apparently gotten a certification as a financial planner online. He was building a clientele. She fawned over a minor investment he'd made while barely asking a single question about my factory project, the largest revitalization in the city. "That building thing you're doing sounds nice, dear," was all she offered before turning back to Evan. I ate my beef, the silence in my chest growing heavier than the food. Finally, my father cleared his throat. The small talk died instantly. The clinking of silverware stopped. This was it. This was the reason for the "we need to talk." "Mira," he began, placing his hands flat on the table. "Your brother, we have an opportunity. A big one." He and Evan exchanged a look. Evan leaned forward, his feigned admiration gone replaced by a hungry gleam. "There's a commercial block up for sale," Evan said, his voice quick. "Right adjacent to that factory you're working on. Its value is going to skyrocket once your project is done. It's a gold mine." I kept my face neutral, though my heart had started a low, cold drumbeat. "We've been in talks with the owner," my father cut in. "But we need more capital to secure the deal, and frankly, we need the credibility. Your name, your firm. It would seal it." The gaslighting when it came was so familiar it was almost comforting. "This is a family opportunity, Mira," my father said, his voice taking on that tone of paternal authority I knew was reserved for manipulation. "It's time you helped us for once," Evan chimed in, the smirk returning. "You've been off in the city doing your own thing for years. We're trying to build something here." My father nodded gravely. "You wouldn't be where you are without us, you know. We gave you a good foundation. We supported you." My blood went ice cold. Supported me. The word hung in the air, a grotesque lie. They hadn't supported me. They had survived me. I let the silence stretch, watching them. They thought this was a negotiation. They thought I was the same quiet girl who would hand over her science project. I looked at my mother, who was nodding along, her eyes pleading. "It would be so good for all of us," she whispered. I finally spoke, my voice quiet, but it cut through the room. "Why did you skip my graduation?" The question landed like a stone. Evan rolled his eyes. My father looked annoyed at the change of subject. But my mother, she flinched. "Mira, don't," she started. "I'm serious, Mom. I want to know. I had 3 empty seats in the front row. Why?" My mother wrung her hands, her eyes darting to Evan. "Honey," she said, her voice dropping to that soft, apologetic whisper that had defined my childhood. "You know how Evan gets. He was going through something, a really bad patch. We couldn't leave him alone. We just couldn't." The excuse, so flimsy, so predictable, hit me like a physical slap. My master's degree, 6 years of my life, wiped away by a bad patch. I wasn't a daughter to be celebrated. I was an obligation to be rescheduled. I finally saw the truth. I didn't matter until I became useful. A strange, cold calm settled over me. The anger, the hurt, it all just crystallized. I slowly pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood. I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. Evan looked startled. "Where are you going?" "We're not done." I picked up my purse and my keys. "I'll think about it," I said. My voice was even almost pleasant. But my eyes found my father's, and for the first time in my life I didn't look away. I let him see the ice. I let him see the end, and he saw it. His face hardened, the confusion replaced by a flicker of sudden dawning comprehension. He knew I wasn't just thinking about the deal. He knew I was done. I didn't speed on the drive back to Minneapolis. I drove exactly the speed limit, my hands steady on the wheel, the cold clarity settling over me like a sheet of ice. The rage I had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a profound, chilling quiet. It wasn't a family invitation. It was a business grab. They hadn't seen me, the successful architect, the daughter who had made it. They had seen a tool, a signature, a new source of capital. They had seen an extension of Evan's needs, a new person to fix his problems. The thought that I had for even a second hoped for something more, for pride, for an apology, left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had spent my entire life waiting to be chosen, and the one time they finally called it was only because I had something they wanted to take. By the time I walked back into my apartment, the sun was rising, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't sleep. I made coffee and went straight to my drafting table. This was my turf, not theirs. I began researching the commercial block. Evan was right about one thing: it was a gold mine. But he was wrong about everything else. It wasn't publicly listed. I had to make 3 calls to industry contacts before I got a name: Arthur Vance. He was an older gentleman, a 3rd-generation owner of the block, and notoriously resistant to selling. My family hadn't been in talks. They had been pestering him, and he had been rebuffing them. I found an old interview with him in a local business journal where he lamented how developers wanted to flatten the soul of the city. He wasn't holding out for the highest bidder. He was holding out for the right one. He wanted to sell to someone who planned to preserve the character of the buildings, not send in the bulldozers. My father and Evan, with their new venture, were the very definition of the greed he despised. My strategy formed quickly, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of preservation. This was what I did. I didn't tear things down, I built them up. I didn't have the kind of new money my family imagined, not for a purchase this big. My money was tied up in my firm and my life. But I had something they didn't, a community. I spent the next 48 hours on the phone, not with banks but with people. I called the woman who owned the bakery I'd redesigned, whose business had tripled. I called the local construction firm that I'd partnered with from the beginning. I called the community investment group that had helped fund the Greenway portion of my factory project. I presented it as an opportunity, an extension of the work we were already doing. I showed them my sketches drawn with a feverish intensity, designs that didn't demolish the historic facades but restored them, turning the old hardware store into a community market, the abandoned theater into a performance space. It was stewardship. It was the antithesis of my family's slash-and-burn greed. I got a meeting with Arthur Vance. I walked in with my portfolio and two of my community investors, not with a slick, empty-suited financial planner like Evan. I didn't talk about profit margins. I talked about history. I talked about legacy. I showed him how the block would integrate with the factory, creating a walkable, vibrant neighborhood that honored its past. He listened, his eyes rarely leaving my sketches. He asked two questions. When can you start, and can you beat the other offer? I knew who the other offer was from. We can, I said, and we'll break ground in 6 months. The signing was 3 days later. We met at a title office downtown. The room was quiet, smelling of old paper and industrial-strength coffee. Arthur, my investors, and I sat around a polished mahogany table. When the lawyer slid the acquisition papers in front of me, my hand was perfectly steady. This wasn't a betrayal. This was a correction. I thought about the 3 empty seats at my graduation, the hollow feeling of my name being called into a void. I thought about the framed blue ribbon in my parents' living room. As my pen moved across the signature line, I felt the click of a lock finally falling into place. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the hollow applause of that day. This time the paper in my hand meant everything. I had built this. I had earned this. I owned it. I pushed the papers back to the lawyer and smiled. I had just bought my freedom. I was walking back to my car, the keys to my new property, feeling heavy and real in my pocket, when my phone buzzed. It was a group text from my parents. Family dinner. Tonight. Mandatory. When I walked in, the tension was so thick I could practically smell it over the scent of my mother's pot roast. Evan was already at the table, drumming his fingers impatiently on the wood. My father stood by the fireplace, trying to look authoritative like a king surveying his domain, but the muscle ticking in his jaw gave him away. My mother Donna was fluttering nervously between the kitchen and the dining room. I noticed she had set extra plates as if she was expecting to serve peace and reconciliation along with the gravy. The gesture was so transparent, so pathetically hopeful, it almost made me sad. I sat down, placing my leather folio on the table beside my plate. Glad you could make it, my father said, his voice stiff. We have a lot to finalize. They didn't even wait for the food to be served. My father launched right into the investment plan again, laying out the numbers they had clearly fabricated, talking about percentages and timelines. Evan chimed in, his voice slick and practiced, talking about the massive ROI and how our family name would finally mean something in this town. I listened in silence. I didn't interrupt. I let them lay the entire pathetic fantasy out on the table. I watched my mother nod along, her eyes shining with pride, completely blind to the fact that her son was a con man and her husband his willing accomplice. They talked for 10 solid minutes, their voices filling the room with hot air and entitlement. When they finally finished, my father looked at me, a paternal, expectant smile on his face. So, Mira, we just need your signature on the capital agreement. Your brother has the papers. I didn't look at Evan. I kept my eyes on my father. Slowly, I reached for my leather folio. I unzipped it. Evan started to pull a stack of papers from his own briefcase, but I held up one hand. Wait, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through their excitement like a knife. The room went silent. Evan froze. My father's smile faltered. I pulled a single thick document from my folio and slid it across the table. It stopped directly in front of my father's plate. It was the fully executed, signed and recorded deed to the commercial block. His eyes scanned the first page. His face went from confusion to disbelief to a dark mottled red. Evan snatched the paper, his eyes flying across the text. "What is this?" Evan spat out. "This is you. You bought it." The realization hit him and he slammed his fist on the table. "You stole it. You went behind our backs and you stole our deal." My father's reaction was colder, more terrifying. He looked at me, his eyes as hard as granite. "You sabotaged your own family," he said, his voice a low growl. "After everything we've done for you, you intentionally sabotaged us." My mother just looked at me, her face crumbling, tears welling in her eyes. "Mira, why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you hurt us like this? This was for the family." That was the word that broke me. Family. A calm, steady, heartbreaking clarity washed over me. The years of swallowing my anger, of accepting the scraps, it all just fell away. "I didn't hurt this family," I said, my voice as steady as my hands. "I just stopped being its victim." I looked at Evan. "I remember a 5th-grade science project, a volcano. I remember you taking it and winning a blue ribbon that still hangs in the living room." I looked at my mother. "I remember my college savings, the money I earned waitressing every weekend for 2 years, disappearing to pay for his DUI attorney. I remember you telling me, 'He needs direction. You can take care of yourself.'" My voice didn't waver. I recounted every holiday I'd spent alone, because they were managing one of Evan's crises. Every achievement, my scholarships, my first job, my first apartment that went entirely unacknowledged. And then I got to the end. "I remember my graduation," I said, my gaze locking on all 3 of them. "My master's degree. I remember standing in that stadium looking for you. I remember the 3 empty seats in the front row, the ones with Dalton printed on them. I remember the text, 'Mom.' Something came up with Evan. He was having a bad day." I leaned forward, the full, crushing weight of their neglect finally given a voice. "For 20 years you taught me that I didn't matter. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who would just absorb the shock and fix the problems. I was invisible. Until today. Today I'm suddenly very, very visible. Do you know why?" I tapped the deed still lying on the table. "Because I'm not Mira the daughter anymore. I'm Mira the asset." I let the word hang in the air. I delivered the final blow, looking my father dead in the eye. "You didn't want me at this table. You wanted my money. You wanted my name. You wanted my success. You just never wanted me." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any argument. I stood up, zipping my empty folio. Evan, his face purple with rage, muttered something venomous under his breath, something about me being a cold-hearted bitch. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, the golden boy, the son they all orbited, and I felt nothing but pity. "I'm done letting you write my story," I said quietly. And then, for the first time in my life, I turned my back on them and walked out the door. The drive back to Minneapolis was different this time. I wasn't cold anymore. I wasn't numb. I was just empty. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the dull ache of a wound finally cleaned. I walked into my apartment, the silence a welcome contrast to the venomous quiet I had left behind. I expected to feel triumphant, victorious. I had won. I had taken back my power. I had finally unequivocally stood up for myself. But as I stood in my living room overlooking the city lights and the dark skeleton of the factory I was bringing back to life, all I felt was a profound hollowness. The echo of the slammed door resonated louder than the victory. I threw myself back into my life, back into the work that had saved me. The factory project became my sanctuary. I was on site from dawn until long after the crews left my hands covered in plaster dust, my mind focused on blueprints and load-bearing walls. I made a point to hire local cruise people from the surrounding neighborhoods. I partnered with small independent business owners, a coffee roaster, a bookstore, a co-op gallery to fill the ground floor retail spaces. We didn't just build, we invested. We designed public green spaces, community rooms, and areas for local artists. My project thrived, breathing life back into a forgotten corner of the city. It was the exact opposite of what my family had wanted to do, a monument to stewardship, not greed. News from my hometown travels fast. My phone, which had been silent for so long, began to light up. At first, it was just messages from old high school acquaintances, people who had also orbited Evan's glow. Heard what happened at your parents'. Damn girl. But then deeper, more meaningful messages started to trickle in. An old neighbor, a woman whose own talents had been overshadowed by her husband's political career, sent me a long email. "Thank you for showing us what it means to claim your own worth," she wrote. Another message came from a former classmate admitting he'd always been jealous of Evan, but always admired my resilience. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had been living in the shadow of someone else's son. Their admiration felt good, but it was a thin warmth unable to touch the cold spot deep inside me. The echo of my departure had fractured my family, just as I knew it would. The consequences rippled outward, sparing no one. My mother, Donna, began a campaign of long, rambling apologetic texts. "I never meant to make you feel unseen, Mira. I just love your brother so much, and he's so fragile. Please, can we just talk? This is tearing your father apart." Her apologies were always wrapped in justifications for Evan, and I didn't reply. My father, Carl, retreated into a ashamed, bitter silence. I heard from my aunt that he barely left the house. He was a man whose entire identity was built on authority and provider status, and I had dismantled both. I had shown him to be a failure, not just as a businessman, but as a father. And Evan spiraled. His pride, the only real currency he had ever possessed, was wounded beyond repair. His financial plans, which had apparently been built entirely on the acquisition of that block, were ruined. Without my name or my capital, his house of cards collapsed. He had been leveraging promises he couldn't keep. I heard he lost his clients, that his new red truck was in danger of being repossessed. His downfall was swift and public, and this I thought should have been my victory. This was the revenge. This was the justice for the stolen science project, the emptied savings account, the empty graduation seats. But as I stood on the roof of my nearly completed factory, watching the sunset paint the skyline in hues of orange and purple, the feeling wasn't triumph. It was just quiet. Revenge didn't feel like a win. It just felt like the end. It hadn't healed anything. It hadn't filled the empty seats from my past. It had just confirmed they would always be empty. In that quiet, a devastating realization settled over me. I had cut out the toxic part of my life, but in doing so, I had severed the whole limb. And I was alone. I still wanted a family. I still craved that sense of belonging, the unconditional support I had spent my whole life trying to earn. I just didn't want their family, not on their old terms. I didn't want to be the ballast, the fixer, the invisible support system. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be chosen. And I realized, with a deep, aching sorrow, that the people I had just destroyed were the only family I had. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 5. I didn't know how to move forward. I had won the war, but I had no idea how to live with the peace. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked at the screen. A new voicemail. From Evan. I hadn't heard his voice in weeks. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but something made me press play. His voice wasn't the slick, charismatic tone of the golden boy. It was broken. Raw. Mira. He choked out, his voice thick with a panic I had never heard before. Mira, something bad happened. I need your help. Please. God, Mira, please. I stood there on that rooftop for a long time, the broken, desperate sound of Evan's voice playing over and over in my head. I need your help. Please. My first instinct was a cold, bitter wave of no. It was a trap. It was another one of his crises, another mess he had made, another vortex designed to pull me back into orbit. He had a partner. He had a business. It was all a lie, just like the rest of him. I should delete the message, block his number, and walk away. I had earned that right. I had bought that right with every empty seat and every stolen dollar. But I didn't. That one word, please, had been different. It wasn't the sound of entitlement. It was the sound of genuine terror. Against my better judgment, I called him back. He picked up on the first ring, his voice a hoarse whisper. Mira. He finally revealed the crisis, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed confession. His business partner, the one who had funded his flashy new life, wasn't a partner at all. He was a shark. He had used Evan as a straw man, putting his name on fraudulent loan applications and shady investments. Now the partner was gone, the money was gone, and Evan was the only one left holding the bag. He was in serious legal trouble, facing charges of fraud and embezzlement. They think I did it, Mira, he sobbed, his voice cracking. They think I was in on it, but I wasn't. I swear, I wanted what you had. I wanted to be the one who made it. He told me our parents were overwhelmed, frightened. The bank was threatening to put a lien on their house, the house I grew up in, which they had apparently put up as collateral for one of Evan's loans. I hung up my hands, shaking. This was the ultimate test. He was handing me a loaded gun. I could let him fall. I could let him face the consequences he so richly deserved. It would be justice. But the image that came to my mind wasn't of Evan. It was of my mother, her face crumbling in fear. It was of my father, looking old and ashamed by his fireplace. I had wanted revenge, but this wasn't revenge. It was annihilation. And I had to confront the deepest, most inconvenient truth of all. I didn't want them destroyed. I just wanted them to see me. With a sigh that felt like it came from the very foundation of my bones, I grabbed my keys and went home. The house felt different. The artificial pride was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of fear. My father was at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked small. The authority was gone. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes red-rimmed, and he looked older than I had ever seen him. My mother saw me from the hallway and just burst into tears, a raw, painful sound that had none of its usual manipulation. Evan was on the sofa staring at a blank television screen, looking like a hollowed-out version of himself. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no charisma, just shame. I didn't think you'd come, he whispered. I'm not here to save you, Evan. I said, my voice quiet but firm. I'm not here to fix this. And then he finally broke. He admitted everything. He admitted he'd been jealous of me his entire life. He admitted that when I got scholarships, he'd felt like a failure. He admitted to intentionally sabotaging opportunities for me growing up, forgetting to give me messages about summer programs, telling our parents I wasn't interested in things I'd been desperate for. It was just so easy for you, Mira, he cried. And it was so hard for me. I wanted them to keep choosing me. It was never easy. I said the words sharp and clean. You just never looked long enough to see the work. You only saw the results. And they chose you every single time, Evan. They chose you over me over and over until I had no choice but to leave. I didn't absolve them. I didn't say, it's okay. The hard truths had to be spoken, and this time they had to listen. I laid out my terms. These were boundaries, not walls. I wouldn't be their emotional support. I wouldn't be their bank. But I wouldn't let them drown. I spent the next 2 days in a cold, precise flurry of action. I helped my father go through his finances, setting him up with a debt consolidation expert to protect the house. It wasn't a bailout. It was a plan. I found a community support group for my mother, a place for spouses and parents of people with financial and legal trouble so that I wouldn't become her therapist. And for Evan, I made one phone call. I connected him with an honest, competent public defender I knew through my community work. He'll tell you the truth, I told Evan, and you have to listen to him, and you have to tell him everything. Something shifted. As I worked, they watched me. They listened. When I spoke about the past, about the pain, they didn't offer excuses. They didn't say, but Evan was fragile. They just nodded. They absorbed it. My mother, in a moment of quiet, just said, "We failed you, Mira. I see that now." It wasn't a fix. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement. The emotional repair, the real agonizing work was just beginning. On the third day, as I was packing my bag to head back to the city, my father stopped me at the door. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary, fragile hope I'd never seen. You're a remarkable woman, Mira," he said, his voice thick. "We don't deserve you." He paused, clearing his throat. Can we start again?" Several months passed, a blur of concrete, dust, final inspections, and the frantic, chaotic energy of creation. The legal battle for Evan was ongoing, a grim, grinding process that I remained purposefully distant from, though I knew he was following his lawyer's advice. My parents were in financial counseling, slowly digging themselves out of the hole Evan had created. We spoke, but it was hesitant, careful. They were calls about logistics, not feelings. The old dynamic was gone, but a new one hadn't yet been built. We were standing in the wreckage, unsure of what to salvage. I poured every ounce of that uncertainty into my work, and now my project, my factory, my community, my testament was finished. The grand opening was a festival. We had shut down the street, the newly preserved block, and the revitalized factory gleaming under a perfect, cloudless Minnesota sky. The air vibrated with life, smelling of fresh paint sawdust, and the intoxicating aromas from a dozen food trucks. Live music spilled from the community stage, and the restored alleyways were packed with local vendors and artisans. Families, couples, kids, the entire community had shown up, their faces bright with curiosity and joy. This was what I had built. Not a monument to my own ego, not a cold financial asset, but a space for people to be. I stood on the steps of the main building, my heart feeling so full it might actually burst. One of my partners nudged me toward the microphone for a short speech. I hadn't prepared one. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the children drawing with chalk on the new pavement, at the old-timers sitting on benches that I had sketched. My voice when I spoke was a little shaky. "Thank you all for coming." I started the words feeling small. When we started this was just a broken building. It was a place people forgot, but it was never empty. It was just full of potential. I talked about the importance of building spaces that people deserve, places that honor the past instead of erasing it. I talked about resilience, about how a community, like a person, can rebuild itself after the hardest times. I found my voice getting thick, my throat tightening. And I finished. I learned that sometimes forgiveness is just the act of building something new together. I didn't mention my family. I couldn't. But the words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning only I understood. The applause was warm and real, nothing like the hollow static of my graduation. As I stepped down, smiling and shaking hands, I saw movement in the back of the crowd near the old restored theater. It was a flicker of motion, a group of 3 people standing awkwardly just outside the main flow of the crowd. My breath hitched. It was them. Carl, Donna, Evan. They were standing together, hands clasped, looking utterly out of place. My father was in a stiff-looking blazer, my mother clutching her purse to her chest. Evan. Evan looked thinner, his face pale, the arrogant smirk I had known his whole life completely gone. He just looked tired. They weren't laughing. They weren't mingling. They were just there, watching me. They came. After everything. After I had taken away their power, exposed their flaws, and refused to save them. They drove all this way to my event, my triumph, and they showed up. This time there were no empty seats. I felt a dozen different emotions war inside me: anger, suspicion, a deep aching pull of old loyalty. I excused myself from the conversation I was in and began walking toward them, my feet feeling like lead. Each step was a choice. I could ignore them. I could tell them to leave. The old Mira would have braced for the impact, prepared for the inevitable crisis, the demand, the subtle guilt trip. But as I got closer, I saw their faces clearly. They weren't here to ask for anything. They were just terrified. Terrified I would turn them away. And in that, I saw the first fragile shift. I stopped a few feet away from them. My mother's eyes were already brimming with tears. My father, the man whose authority I had once feared, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before: pure, unadulterated pride. "Mira," he said, his voice soft, almost rough. He cleared his throat. This is... it's incredible. What you've done here." My mother just nodded, unable to speak. Evan kept his eyes on the pavement, his shame a tangible thing. I just waited. I didn't make it easy for them. We didn't want to interrupt. My father continued, fumbling for words. We wanted to see. We wanted to be here for you, for real this time. For real this time. The words echoed in the space between us. I looked at the three of them, this broken, humbled, complicated group of people who shared my blood. I didn't forget the past. I didn't pretend the scars weren't there. The empty seats at my graduation would always be a part of my story. The stolen science project, the emptied savings account, those were real, and they had shaped me. But as I looked at my father's earnest, hopeful face, my mother's quiet, repentant tears, and my brother's profound, humbling shame, I realized the revenge I thought I wanted had burned away, leaving something new in its place. An opening, a possibility. I didn't have to erase the past to make room for a future. I just had to unlock the door. I took a small breath, and I let the door open just enough. "The music's about to start on the main stage," I said, my voice quiet. You should come and listen." My father's shoulders relaxed, a small, shaky smile touching his lips. My mother let out a sob that sounded like relief. I used to think healing meant going back, trying to fix what was broken, trying to force them to see what they had missed. But maybe healing wasn't about the past at all. Maybe healing is choosing who walks forward with you. And so Mira's long-held anger finally gave way to a quiet, complicated peace. Family wounds are always the deepest. What did you think of Mira's final choice to let her family back in? We read every single comment of your thoughts, so please share them below. For more stories of complex betrayal and healing, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.